Good evening, everybody. My name is Christine Wallach, and I'm a trustee here at the American Academy. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's American Academy lecture on sustaining democracies, the role of conversations across difference, and to introduce my very good friend, our distinguished visitor this evening, Dr. Ronald Crutcher. Ron, thanks very much for being here with us. The topic tonight couldn't be more pressing, and it's very apt that the lecture is taking place here in a once divided city where conversations for decades across differences were impossible, and then, of course, finally succeeded. But today, we're face to face with myriad situations where dialogue is needed between communities, between nations, between political, religious, racial groups, and across the ideological spectrum. The American Academy's mission is to foster dialogue and greater understanding, so I'm truly delighted to have you, Ron, with us here tonight to discuss what's needed for authentic conversations across political and ideological perspectives. Many of you here tonight need no introduction to Ron's distinguished career and accomplishments, but just in case you do, I'm delighted to tell you about him. I've had the pleasure of knowing Ron for many years, and the longer I know him, the more I treasure him. He's a true rara avis. He's not only an academic expert and scholar par excellence in his field of music, he's a practicing cellist who made his Carnegie Hall debut in 1985. And he's a national leader in U.S. higher education. Ron was president of the University of Richmond in Virginia, somewhat troubled city in Virginia, from 2015 to 2021, where he was also professor of music. Prior to this, he was president of Wheaton College for 10 years. He's also on the board of a pioneering liberal arts university here in Berlin, Bard College Berlin. As a national leader in higher education, Ron writes and speaks widely on the value of a liberal education and the democratic purpose of higher education, the role of universities, colleges in creating engaged citizens who are prepared to have conversations across differences and to participate actively in sustaining democracy. Ron also advises universities, nonprofits, and corporations in the U.S. and abroad on issues of organizational culture and bridging racial and cultural divides. His thematic memoir, which I recommend to you, entitled I Had No Idea You Were Black, Navigating Race on the Road to Leadership, was published in 2021. As a music scholar and musician, Ron has written extensively about the performing arts and has consulted internationally for many music and fine arts programs. He served on the boards of the Boston, Cleveland, and Austin Symphony Orchestras, as well as the Richmond Symphony. A former member of the Cincinnati Symphony, he now plays with the world-renowned Klemperer Trio, of which he's been a member for over 40 years. Finally, let me also say that Ron has deep and abiding ties to Germany since his days here in the 1970s. Well, not here, but as a student at the University of Bonn in former West Germany. So I'm delighted to welcome him back home, as it were. Just a few seconds on the structure of the evening. Ron's talk will last 30 to 40 minutes. We'll have a Q&A to follow. If you're here, you're all welcome to ask questions. Those of you who are joining by Zoom, use the Q&A section in the Zoom platform. We'll do our best to get to all of as many questions as we can. And now, without further ado, Ron, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christine, for that kind introduction. And it's indeed a pleasure for me to be here this evening. I mean, as Christine mentioned, my wife and I, Dr. Betty Neal Crutcher, spent our sabbatical year, our Sabbatjahr here. After 10 years at Wheaton College, we found a beautiful house, beautiful apartment on Munzenstrasse. And so we've been coming every year since then, and we always stay at the Hotel Bristol Unfortunately, Betty is not here with me this time because she's with our daughter at a meeting in Philadelphia, but we'll be coming back in June, actually, to visit friends. And when we were here in 2014-15, we came to many lectures here at the American Academy, so it's a real honor for me to be one of the lecturers this evening. Thank you so much. And I want to thank my many friends in the audience tonight, people that we've met while we were living here in Germany, people that I knew from my time at the University of Austin, and my dear friend Rita Dove and Fred Febon. Rita and I have known each other since we were young, very, very young. So thank you so much for coming. So my lecture this evening is presented from the perspective of a seasoned academic leader who happens also, as Christine said, to be a performing artist. As Christine said, I played with the Klemperer Trio for almost 40 years. We no longer perform together anymore. We played our last concert in 2017, but I'll actually go visit them, and we stopped playing together because everything was crazy, and we're also older. We're all over 70. We're all senior citizens, so we're doing other things. I was able to remain active as a performer. Indeed, I performed a recital just last month at my former college, Wheaton College, where I did a half recital and an interview about my book, because during my presidency, I would get up every morning at 5 a.m. I assure you, I don't do that anymore, to practice the cello. So I make that disclaimer because I'm not a social scientist, I'm not a political scientist or an economist or a historian. I'm a humanist, and my perspective, of course, is also influenced by my experience as an African American who has worked for his entire career in predominantly white spaces. Additionally, I've served as the chair of the board of the American Council on Education. That's the umbrella organization for all of higher education in the United States. It's a convening and lobbying organization. I was actually one of the longest serving board members. I was on that board for 10 years, not 10 consecutive years, 3 in my first presidency, and then 7 most recently. I had my last board meeting 2 weeks ago. So I'm very much attuned to all of the nuances of higher education in the United States. I mention that because these are the lenses through which I view higher education, the challenges facing it today, and the role it could and should play in sustaining our democracy. Now, before I begin, I want to share something with you that an encounter I had just last week where I gave a series of 3 lectures at Mercer University in Macon, Georgia, and I gave a version of this lecture. And during the question and answer period, a young man raised his hand and he asked me, "Is it too late for conversations across difference?" And and he related his own experience as a poll worker and the fact that as a poll worker, he noticed that people from the various ideological and political perspectives didn't want to talk to each other. And I said to him, well, as an educator, I have to remain positive. I have to see the world as a glass half full, not glass half empty. And really, one of the reasons I'm focusing on this topic is that I think we in higher education need to do, not just in the United States, I'm going to the University of Augsburg to give a similar lecture next week, in Europe and all around the world, in inculcating in our students a sense that they are responsible for ensuring that that liberal democracies are maintained and are sustained. And finally, I'll say I don't have any illusions here. I don't think that solely through conversations across difference are we going to save democracy, but that in itself is kind of the ground level. That's a fundamental requirement. So I begin. In an increasingly polarized world, it has become almost impossible to have authentic conversations across different perspectives, from race and gender to politics and ideology. The vigorous debate of competing ideas has been an essential component of well-functioning democratic societies for centuries. And yet, in today's climate, various factions not only congregate in like-minded bubbles, they also are reluctant to interact with those in opposing bubbles. What are the forces that led us here? What are their implications for sustaining our democratic society? And what is the role of higher education in creating engaged citizens who are prepared to have conversations across difference? I am particularly interested in looking at effective approaches to doing that work. Now, first, let me clarify what I mean by democratic societies. I'm referring here to those nations governed by liberal democracies, a type of representative government in which the wishes of the majority also make room for unpopular or minority opinions. One of the many rights and freedoms enshrined in the United States Constitution, for instance, is the protection of less popular or controversial opinions, referred to with the shorthand freedom of speech, along with freedom of assembly and religion. Liberal democracies also tolerate a broad range of political and social views. Even views considered to be on the fringe are permitted to coexist and, if you will, compete for political relevance in a liberal democracy. The means by which they compete for political relevance and ultimately power is vigorous debate. But vigorous debate has become almost impossible in a world where people are unwilling to listen to one another, which brings us to the place we find ourselves today, where conversations across political, racial, or religious difference are increasingly fraught. Now, to add a bit of levity before I plunge in, a friend of mine found the following poem on a garage in Pittsburgh about a year ago. It presents dialogue from the rather cynical perspective of a dictator. This is by the Venezuelan poet and essayist Rafael Cadenas. Dialogue according to a dictator. Original version. When I engage in dialogue, I don't want to be interrupted. Second version. I'll engage in dialogue, but I warn you, I won't give up my position. Third version. In a dialogue, those who contradict me should recognize their mistake ahead of time. Fourth version. Having thought about it, I humbly opine that dialogue is unnecessary. So here's my shorthand version. Listen to me and don't interrupt me with your thoughts. I'm not changing my mind. Your thoughts are wrong anyway. I'm done with this conversation. If we are to have successful dialogue and a stronger democracy, we must stop this kind of approach. Let me begin by sharing a personal story. 25 years ago, long before I'd become a college president, I was hurrying to meet the CEO of an oil company in Houston, Texas, to discuss the possibility of his funding a scholarship for violin students. He was the chairman of a foundation that provided financial support for violin study. We'd never met, but I was head of the School of Music at the University of Texas at Austin, and this moment had been months in the making. We said hello, shook hands, and sat down to talk. Then he blurted it out. I had no idea you were black. This was not at all how I'd imagined our conversation beginning. And I'll admit, I was angry. What kind of racist was this man? I wondered if I should just cut the conversation short and walk away. Instead, I took a long breath, as I had been taught to do by my father when someone says something that knocks you off your feet. By this point in my career, I was an accomplished cellist and educator who toured internationally and earned Yale University's first doctorate in cello performance. I didn't think I needed to tolerate this kind of nonsense, but I decided to listen. The man continued to talk. He and his wife had attended the Aspen Music Festival for several years, and they rarely saw any string players of color in the orchestra. He wondered aloud about the dearth of string players of color and whether the classical music community could do better in nurturing artists from varied backgrounds. Here was my opening. After all, I was there on a mission, so I talked about why there were not more string players of color and what the University of Texas was trying to do in that regard. I told the CEO about one student in particular, a young woman of color in whom I saw an enormous potential for a career in classical music. The CEO and I both loved the same art form, I realized, and there we could connect, our shared enthusiasm for classical music far overshadowing my initial discomfort. A few weeks later, the man had gifted our music school with the scholarship I'd sought, and my student went on to earn a coveted position in the viola section of the Cleveland Orchestra. I often tell this story as a cautionary tale against jumping to conclusions and cutting off conversation. But over the years, student reactions to it have changed. These days, their primary response is horror at what they see as the CEO's unpardonable insensitivity around race. What specifically do you find offensive? I recently asked a group of students that I mentor. How would you have responded? How might the CEO have initiated this conversation in a manner less offensive to you? There is no right answer, of course. My aim is to spur their thinking about how we might all do a better job of navigating divides. I think you all know what I mean when I say that you yourselves have to find that moment and think about what you are doing. Are you listening solely to change someone's mind? Or are you listening to engage authentically and maybe even evolve your own thinking? In our current cultural moment, the latter has become increasingly difficult. In fact, the conversation has become almost like a tango, where there is this push and pull. You push me a few steps away in one way, I push back in the other direction, and we never come to a new meeting place in the middle. I confess I am surprised that it has become so difficult to have these types of conversations across difference. I thought by now the USA in particular would have learned to bridge its many divides. I remember when I graduated from college in 1969, I believed that by the dawn of the 21st century, we would have consigned to the dustbin of history what W.E.B. Du Bois called the problem of the color line. In his Souls of Black Folk, 14 essays about life after the Civil War, which was published in 1903, Du Bois wrote that, quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of darker to lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea," end of quote. Clearly, Du Bois' prophecy regarding this problem was even more long-lasting than he envisioned. Well into the 21st century, events of the past few years remind us that widespread understanding and acceptance of difference remain a dream rather than reality. That is as much true in Germany and other countries in the European Union as it is in the United States. Consider America's far from complete national reckoning with race and racism in the wake of George Floyd's murder in 2020. And then over the past year, the push from lawmakers in a number of states to pass laws that prohibit the teaching of so-called divisive concepts. Think, too, of the 2020 presidential election in the United States and the extreme polarization revealed in its wake. Roughly 70% of Republicans in the USA today believe that Donald Trump won that election. We also saw American insurrectionists, fueled by vitriol and hate, violently breach the U.S. Capitol and try to overturn the will of the people. As an educator, I've been especially alarmed to see how the politics and rhetoric inflaming our country are increasingly spilling onto campuses, fomenting a climate in which even the most innocent inquiry can become suspect. To be sure, all inquiries are not innocent. But since 2015, in the United States, student demonstrations over free speech and racial bias have resulted in faculty firings, resignations, and physical assaults on campuses from Connecticut to Washington State. While these demonstrations have so far been scattershot, they are like seeds with the potential to grow an entrenched culture in which those who espouse controversial views are shamed and silenced unless we do more to teach and model substantive dialogue and disagreement. A 2020 survey by the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education and College Pulse found that 6 out of 10 students could recall an instance when they had censored their own opinions out of fear for how their peers or professors might respond. This includes 75% of students who had identified as strong Republicans and 63% of Black students. While self-censorship is not necessarily bad, it can inhibit open and honest discussion in an academic setting, which ultimately impedes learning. In my opinion, the process of intellectual inquiry requires the exploration of competing ideas. But it is impossible to have this kind of discourse if one is afraid of making a mistake or offending or asking an insensitive question. Jonathan Rauch, in his insightful book, The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth, states, quote, "Self-censorship is part of living together. We call it courtesy. but not when it impedes honest conversation and criticism in university intellectual life, where honest conversation and criticism are the whole point of being there, end of quote. Now, I started thinking seriously about conversations across difference in September 2016 when I participated in a convening of college presidents by the American Council on Education and the Knight Foundation. That year, the foundation began an annual survey of high school and college student attitudes about free expression. The percentage of students believing that speech rights are secure has fallen every year since, including a 12-point decrease from 2019 as an increasing number of students, particularly Republicans, say they believe their speech rights are threatened. In further review of these findings over the years, it becomes clear that students say they support free expression and inclusion in nearly equal measure. Yet, all too often, students focus on how free expression and inclusivity are in conflict rather than how they can mutually reinforce one another. How did this happen? In my opinion, American college and university leaders bear considerable responsibility for perpetuating this environment. We have done so in part by failing to heed fundamental lessons from the civil rights era. During that period, I was a college student in the United States, and there was a strong focus on increasing the number of black and brown students at predominantly white universities. However, there was little emphasis on building community between and among these students, many of them the first in their families to attend higher education, and white students. It is virtually impossible to foster more inclusive communities simply by increasing representational diversity. Now, I must be honest and count myself among those of us in the 60s who naively believed that opening institutions of higher education to people of all backgrounds would magically transform them into more welcoming places. It was as though we thought that once there were more black and brown people on our campuses, everyone would link arms and sing Kumbaya and all would be well. Not exactly. Most students in the United States, whatever their color or background, come to college with little experience building cross-cultural relationships or even interacting with people of different races, cultures, and backgrounds. Why? Because we in the United States of America continue to live in a segregated society by race, class, and increasingly political ideology. Research from the Public Religion Research Institute has shown that most Americans have social networks that consist primarily of people from their own race, ethnic background, or political ideology. The echo chambers of some social media platforms serve as an apt image. With respect to race, consider these facts. For white Americans, 91% of their social network is white. For black Americans, 83% of their social network is black. And for Hispanic Americans, 64% of their social network is Latino. These numbers are unsettling for many of us in American higher education, especially since we're striving to create campus communities that look like the multiracial democracy in which most of our graduates will live and work. However comfortable this kind of self-sorting may be, it is antithetical to the spirit of democracy, whose lifeblood is the energetic exchange of diverse and competing ideas. Beverly Daniel Tatum, President Emerita of Spelman College and author of Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, puts it this way, quote, "To work effectively as an agent of change in a pluralistic society, it is necessary to be able to connect with people different from oneself," end of quote. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made the same point in a speech 64 years ago, quote, "People fail to get along because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other, and they don't know each other because they have not communicated with each other," end of quote. As we now recognize, colleges and universities must be intentional about cultivating and leveraging representational diversity as an educational benefit if we are to succeed in graduating empathetic listeners capable of navigating and bridging divides. So how do we do that? How do we build inclusive intercultural communities in which students of all backgrounds and beliefs learn to live and explore ideas and navigate their differences constructively? I believe free expression is the single greatest tool we have to build a more inclusive society. The civil rights movement is a perfect example of free expression in action. During the 1950s and 1960s, civil rights activists such as Dr. King were able to use free expression as a tool to elevate their concerns and ultimately force social change. By exercising their voice, civil rights activists were able to present injustices which led to outlawing racial discrimination. Many of my peers and I also learned this lesson as students in the 1960s when we participated in peaceful protests and campus sit-ins to fight for our rights. More recently, however, a culture of safetyism has taken root. That's a word for students' new expectation that they should be protected from speech, art, or other things that might wound them emotionally. While well-meaning, efforts to insulate young people from those who may offend their sensibilities do little to prepare them for the hard, long-term work of persuading others to embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion. We certainly want our students to always be physically safe. However, in my opinion, there is no place for intellectual safety within an academic institution. In fact, just last month, the president of Cornell University, Martha Pollack, wrote a letter to student leaders in response to a student assembly resolution mandating content warnings for traumatic content in the classroom. In her letter, which she shared with me, rejecting the resolution, President Pollack wrote the following, quote, "Learning to engage with difficult and challenging ideas is a core part of university education, essential to our students' intellectual growth and to their future ability to lead and thrive in a diverse society," end of quote. Now, last year, I discussed many of the themes in this talk with colleagues at the Barenboim Said Academy here in Berlin. And I had a fascinating conversation with one of their humanities professors, actually Professor Ronnie Mann, about the notion of trigger warnings and safetyism. She conjectured that perhaps young people, Generation Z, have a totally different mindset or even a different brain than those of us in old folks like me, 76 years old. In an age when interactions through social media are so pervasive, it could be that Generation Z is more accustomed to curating social interactions with people rather than learning to navigate them. This is an idea I intend to explore with my social science and neuroscience colleagues. Nonetheless, I remain convinced that we must support, nudge, encourage, and ultimately empower our students to learn how to navigate difficult and challenging encounters if they are to become effective, engaged citizens. Additionally, there is another troubling societal trend that has emerged on some college campuses, a tendency among students to demonize those whose beliefs run counter to their own. Yet, the time students spend within our academic communities may be their last and best opportunity to learn how to have conversations across racial, cultural, and ideological differences. A task force convened at the university I most recently led, the University of Richmond, concluded that for the health of our democracy, we must teach students that, quote, "a commitment to fostering a diverse, inclusive community demands an equally strong commitment to freedom of expression," end of quote. This is no easy task. As the legislatures who try to prevent the certification of President Biden remind us, words have consequences, and free expression can not only instruct, it can hurt and divide. Power and position matter too, and some students, including underrepresented students, may feel that they have unequal access to the microphone, leaving them little choice but to shut down debate. Ultimately, though, we must ensure our students enter post-campus life prepared to exercise their right to free expression in order to contribute actively as citizens and leaders. I view our campuses as laboratories for democracy, places where students can test ideas, see them supported, strengthened, and, yes, refuted, and learn from those experiences. If they do not do so while they are with us, we have failed as educators. Indeed, I feel very strongly that it is an abrogation of our responsibility as educators not to ensure that our students have honed these skills. Now, let me give you a concrete example of what I mean and how supporting free expression better equips students to advance the cause of inclusion. During the fall of 2018, a libertarian student organization from the University of Richmond School of Law invited Ryan Anderson of the Heritage Foundation to speak on campus. Many people called for me to disinvite him. Anderson's views were transphobic, they alleged. Some LGBTQ students and employees said his presence on campus made them feel unsafe, and I empathize with them. As a black man in America, I know all too well the discomfort and, at times, fear that can come from the words of others. Yet, while I strongly support trans students and transgender rights and disagree strongly with Anderson's beliefs, I insisted that we allow him to speak. Anderson's thinking was influencing decision makers and had been cited in 2 Supreme Court cases. As several law professors pointed out, their students needed to be familiar with the case law Anderson would be referencing, whether or not they agreed with it. Moreover, one of our law professors would be providing a rebuttal following Anderson's remarks. In my mind, the talk would be a valuable educational opportunity for our students to see how one can hold speakers accountable for their words and, if they so chose, how to protest peacefully. Indeed, I believe it is our mandate as educators to help students craft counter-arguments and develop the intellectual strength necessary to rebut perspectives they find personally challenging or even offensive. In my opinion, we do not help them develop those muscles by insulating them from speakers who might offend. Ultimately, Dr. Anderson came to campus and members of our community protested his appearance vigorously but peacefully. Students dressed in white stood in silence one by one, holding signs of protest. After Anderson's remarks, law professor Judd Campbell joined him on stage for a spirited debate, demonstrating how to marshal arguments against someone with whom you disagree. A group of law students lined up during the question and answer period to pose pointed queries. Later, one of the protesters, who identified as transgender, engaged Anderson in a one-on-one conversation and reflected on the experience in our student newspaper, and I quote, "Coming into this was really hard for me because it's easy to vilify someone when you haven't met them," they wrote. "It's hard to hate someone when you meet them," end of quote. Now, I'll go out on a limb and suggest that this meeting between a young adult and someone they perceived as an enemy was among the most valuable educational experiences that student had all year. The exchange with Mr. Anderson exemplified my firmly held belief that our campuses can serve as laboratories for democracy, but not if debate and dissension are silenced. Please do not misunderstand me. There is much about the current tenor of rhetoric in the United States that offends me. The 2017 racially charged riots in Charlottesville, just an hour's drive from my own campus, were a wake-up call to the true tenor of white supremacy in America. And laws passed recently that ban even a mention of racial or sexual content alleged to make certain families uncomfortable or chilling. Or, for that matter, the rise of the AfD here in Germany during the 2015 refugee crisis. My wife and I were living in Berlin when this organization began to gain prominence. Yet, as ugly as the current political climate may be, I remain convinced that colleges and universities can serve as crucibles for learning how to live and participate constructively in a democratic society. Indeed, colleges and universities provide an optimal space to learn how to navigate the rough waters of polarization, but not if every day is smooth sailing. The world our students will enter after completing their studies is riven with difficult discussions and people by those with whom they will disagree. As campus leaders, we have a duty to lead by example and prepare our students, not isolate them like hothouse flowers. The question is, how else can we use the growing diversity in the United States and Europe as a teaching tool to find common ground, respect the backgrounds that lead to different perspectives, and foster meaningful conversations across barriers? Let me offer you 3 examples of how I and the University of Richmond have linked free expression and inclusion and thereby better prepared students to be active listeners committed to engaging meaningfully with diverse viewpoints, even when what they hear knocks them off balance. First, we launched the Community Dialogue Facilitation Network. Most students coming to university today have little, if any, experiential basis from which to engage in conversations or build relationships across difference. So I believe it is critically important for students to have opportunities to engage in these kinds of dialogue early in their academic careers with facilitators trained to lead intergroup dialogue. This approach to dialogue facilitation emphasizes techniques for leading discussions of polarizing topics and how to address a range of facilitation-related challenges. Now, this program is only in its second year, but as it takes shape, it will bring together faculty, staff, and students to build, strengthen, and use facilitation skills to manage difficult dialogues and encourage active listening. This active listening is ultimately at the heart of bridging racial and cultural divides in our democracy and will help everyone develop empathy, patience, and disciplines, the building blocks of coalition building. Second, the university adopted a free expression statement. I believe each higher education institution has to consider its own individual context to determine whether or not such a statement is necessary. The discussions our faculty, staff, and students had about the statement demonstrated how open inquiry sharpens one's skills to engage a variety of perspectives. The rich diversity of our campuses guarantees students will encounter viewpoints that challenge their own. Our free expression statement reminds students to welcome such moments and listen actively so that they can better understand why individuals with different views think and believe as they do. Finally, on a more personal note, my wife, Dr. Betty Neal Crutcher, and I have a group of students whom we mentor. We do two things with our first-year mentees at the beginning of the semester. First, we require them to complete the Constructive Dialogue Institute program before they come to campus. This program equips people with skills and a shared language to overcome their differences and work together to solve their collective problems. In other words, it provides our mentees the skills needed to engage in difficult conversations. The skills on which we focused are fairly basic. As an example, a skill such as listening closely for understanding is critically important. We had students practice this skill in dyads, taking turns listening to each other for 5 or 10 minutes, talk about various subjects, including their own personal experiences. Since one of the focuses of our multicultural mentoring group is on honing the ability to engage in conversations across racial, cultural, and ideological difference, we found that using constructive dialogue gives our mentees a head start. The other thing that we do is prod our mentees about their own social networks. Do they interact with people from various backgrounds and academic disciplines, or are their networks filled only with people of the same background and beliefs? If the latter, we challenge them to reach out to a classmate who is different, whether culturally, politically, or religiously, and get to know them by asking questions and listening, really listening to the response. The purpose is neither to hone debate skills nor to lay blame. Such approaches change nothing. Instead, the purpose is to once again help students become active listeners, skilled at weathering the challenging views they will inevitably encounter and equipped to create greater understanding. Those conversations can sometimes lead to bruised feelings, but I tell my mentees that is exactly how they will develop the capacity to navigate differences with energy, civility, and substance. In the process, their own beliefs will be tested and refined, and that will better prepare them for engaged citizenship. I strongly believe that our entire U.S. population, perhaps even the world, could benefit from a similar approach. There are currently many efforts at other universities to help students hone the skills necessary for difficult conversations. One of the most promising, however, is the Intercollegiate Civil Disagreement Partnership, consisting of a consortium of colleges and universities across the United States. And they have a threefold mission: to advance fundamental democratic commitments to freedom of expression, equality, and agency; two, to develop student skills to facilitate conversations across political difference; and three, to create spaces for civil disagreement to flourish on campus. The 5 universities include Harvard and Stanford, as well as 2 minority-serving institutions. They've developed a pedagogical narrative and casebook that has lots of information that can be useful. The consortium is now seeking other universities to join them in the near future, and I look forward to hearing more about their work as they expand. My university, the University of Richmond, is far more diverse as we launch into the third decade of the 21st century than ever before. Located in what was the capital of the Confederacy during the Civil War, as a black person, I would not have been admitted to the university when I graduated from high school in 1965. The first black students to arrive did not arrive until 1968. We are using the current breadth in the student population to change the campus culture and to be more inclusive to all. To be sure, this does not mean that we expect to become a utopia immune from racist, xenophobic, or free speech incidents. Instead, the goal is to ensure that we have the capability as a community to deal with social disruption. That is why the three goals of our Making Excellence Inclusive plan are representation, belonging, and capability. In my opinion, the third goal, capability, ensuring that everyone in our community has honed the skill of interacting authentically with people from other cultures, religions, sexual orientations, ethnicities, races, is the most important as the University of Richmond evolves into the truly inclusive community we aspire to be. The University of Richmond, and every higher education institution for that matter, should be for each of our students a practice lab in which to learn how to live in a democratic society. We want tomorrow's citizens and leaders to understand the intellectual benefit of living, learning, and playing in a diverse community, in the literal sense of that word, diverse. The social problems the world faces are knotty and complex. Addressing them effectively will require more perspectives, not fewer. Empathetic and compassionate listening are key elements necessary to build more constructive dialogue. In fact, in a paper by authors from the Council of Europe about the fall of the Berlin Wall, they state, quote, "However important elections, laws, and institutions are, they cannot be democratic unless they build on a set of attitudes and behaviors that seek to resolve conflict through dialogue rather than violence," end of quote. Hence, they have included openness to cultural otherness and to other beliefs, worldviews, and practices, and skills in listening and observing in their proposed list of competencies for all students in universities in Europe. University communities provide an ideal environment to show the leaders of tomorrow how to navigate diverse perspectives or to rethink a position. This is crucial for the health of all liberal democracies. In a bitterly polarized time when any discussion around race, religion, gender, or politics teeters on the edge of diatribe or silence, those of us in higher education hold the power to push against the forces that are dividing us and help graduate students who can find a better way. Thank you. So, oh, please. So I'm open. Questions, dialogue, challenges, I'm open, ready. Yes, please.
You had talked about you spoke about intellectual safety, and I wanted to bring up the topic of tenure and how that is being challenged. And you, my friend, are the closest I have to someone in higher education in the United States that's representing that. I am an American citizen living in Germany, living in Berlin more than 12 years, raising my children here. And there's something very scary about that. But I also recognize that that's all I know. So I'm open to your perspective.
Yes, no, and that's a hot topic today, because just today you may have read that the trustees at the University of the new college in Florida turned down the tenure of cases for five people who had come through the entire system. And for one thing. So first, let me back up and say, I do think, from an intellectual perspective, tenure is important for professors to have the power to, have the right and feel empowered to talk about all subjects, including criticizing the president of the university if they wish, without feeling that they're going to lose their jobs. However, I will say that from my perspective, I think that what we haven't done well in the United States to ensure that there's accountability along with the tenure process. That is to say, to ensure that once you have tenure, you continue to produce. For the majority of faculty members, that's the case, because that's why you go into academia. But there are many examples I can share with you where that's not the case. So I do think when I was at the University of Texas, for instance, back in the 90s, they instituted post-tenure review, which was music to my ears, because out of the 100 faculty members I had at the University of Texas at that time, faculty increases were only based on merit. There was no across-the-board increases. For the 5 years I was there were 5 faculty members who never received a salary increase because they weren't doing anything, right? I would have loved to revoke their tenure. But then, so should I say that in public? Okay. Well, it's okay. It's many years ago. Because they really, and in fact, one of the guys said,
Intellectual safety.
Yes. Yeah. And so we had the review, and unfortunately at that time a decision was made that the reviews would be done randomly. So we literally had to pick names out of a hat. I'm not making this up. I wish I were, but that was the decision that was made. And so the first, I only got to go through one round. In the first round, none of the 5 was in there. We had to do, I think it was 1/5 of the faculty every year. We had to do post-tenure review. So, if I were king of the world, what would I do? If I were king of the higher education world, I would have some kind of system of extended contracts, where you have a 5 or 10-year contract which comes up for review. And I'm accustomed to that, having given up tenure at one institution and been the senior officer at a conservatory of music where there was no tenure. But I would never say that in public to my faculty when I was president. I'll share another story with you. My first year as president of Wheaton College, our largest donor, who would come to only one board meeting a year, Adrienne Mars, all of you know Mars Candy Company. Well, Adrienne Mars and her husband were the top donors. And she said in the meeting, "What about tenure? Why do we have tenure? Why don't we just get rid of it? Why, this?" And so, I'm a new president, right? I've sat there and I said, my response was, "Well, Adrienne, I really love my job." And if I were to convince the board to do away with tenure, I probably would no longer have my job. And unfortunately, Patricia King, who was a law professor at Georgetown and the board chair at the time, weighed in, and helped me out there. So, but in terms of tenure in the United States, nothing will ever change with the tenure unless Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, UVA, unless they make changes to the way they do tenure. So that's convoluted somewhat. Michael, right over here. Listen.
Well, Ron, I thought this was a highly inspiring and wonderful speech. However, the however is important. However, the basic assumption that in the fragmented society, like the United States, or for that matter in Germany, that the makeup of this society in different groups that do not communicate and act together in a kind of democratic or whatever kind of consensus is per se not a good thing, to put it mildly, and maybe the reason for all the things that go wrong, including racist separation. However, there is also the experience of all these minorities and larger groups that would never call themselves minorities, have something going for them. You do feel better and happier in a society that speaks your language, and even if it's only Bavarian, you do feel happier when you know the attitude towards certain cultural phenomena, including religions, are exactly the same as your own. So happiness in smaller groups, always feeling surrounded by larger groups who are different, is actually, socially speaking, not so bad. If I may give two funny examples. Once, when the South Bronx was literally burning down in one of the largest insurance crimes in the history of the United States, it's called in German warmer Abbruch. The owners of the houses burnt down their own houses in New York, with the interesting phenomenon that the New York Times wasn't reporting on it. Although you could see the smokes going up across the river. Why not? Well, it wasn't, the New York Times didn't sell a single paper there. This was a paper where actually La Prensa from Puerto Rico was selling much larger numbers. And there I discovered a small little road of brownstones where people lived who had been descendants of the island of Ponza, which is a tiny, very beautiful island between Naples and Rome. And they all spoke Italian, and they were in their 70s. Why? Well, they were happy there. And if somebody would have forced them, you've got to become Americans, the options to become Americans at the age of 30, 40, or 50 are pretty small. And so the fact that you have all these spots in the United States of social linguistic groups who actually hate to integrate, of course, gives rise to a phenomenon. As a reporter, as you travel the United States, you discover, you go into a black church, which was then still called a black church, and there's always 2 or 3 whites sitting there, like you yourself, totally stunned by the musicality of those services. And then they go home to their boring services at home and think, oh, I wish we could do that too. We could sing like that. It doesn't happen. So your ideal, which I thought was there, that in the end we should all overcome the definite hemness, what is that? The bad sides of non-diversity, of provinciality, of ethnic identity seeking, which has been a big business in the United States. The benefits of the status quo should be taken into account. Not only not to be disappointed when you try to attain the goals that you rightfully described.
Well, I don't see it as either or. I see it both and. I think it's important. I mean, for instance, if there has been a lot of talk in recent years about the positive or negatives of having so-called safe spaces on campus for low-income students or students of color. And the way I view it is from the perspective, Emily Dickinson wrote a poem called The Prop That Holds the House. And the prop holds up the house until the house is built. And so I see it as a prop, a way to help students, I'm talking about students here, who feel as though they're guests in another house. The University of Richmond, for instance, until 20 years ago, was considered to be a white rich person school, because it was predominantly white, and the students from the school have come from high income families, and so when we started increasing the numbers of low income students and students of color, many of the students who didn't come from middle or high incomes felt like guests in someone else's home. So those places for them to engage with each other served as kind of places for them to remain rooted in their backgrounds. But at the same time, they couldn't take their classes with only other people of color. So they had to learn how to make the transition. And it doesn't mean that that safe place goes away. They can always go back to it. So that's the way I see it. But what I'm saying is that if there is not an attempt to to help our students learn how to have those conversations across difference. And let me also say this to you. When I talk to my students and encourage them to sit down with someone who has a different perspective than they do, I say to them, it's not about making friends. You don't have to become that person's friend. It's really about listening closely enough so you understand why that person holds a belief. That person may change their mind about their belief, you may change your mind, but that's not the purpose. The purpose is understanding. So it has to me, both and. Because, my wife and I go to an interracial Episcopal church, but every now and then my wife said, I have to have some black church. We have to go to a black church. I love our church. We have great music at our church. Is one of the reasons I like it. But I grew up in the black church. She grew up in the black church. You feel at home there. It's not that I don't feel at home in St. James Episcopal. We're well known there. We love the people there, but it's not the same kind of experience. Yes. Thank you, Michael.
Well, just by way of introduction, I am from the South Bronx, and it's a great place to be from. Okay. In any case, and my high school was in Little Italy, the area where if you've seen the Green Book movie, that was the Italian neighborhood. But my question regards the ethnic profile of the University of Richmond. Is it predominantly white, or is it?
Yeah, good. Yeah. So good question.
And I have a follow-up on that.
So let me give that, and then I'll come back to you for your follow-up question. So I cannot take credit for this. I have to give credit to my colleague. I'm pointing to Professor Dove because she works at his former institution from the University of Virginia, Ed Ayers. When he came to the University of Richmond in 2007, we had only 9% of our students who were low income. Pell Grant eligible is the term we use. 11% were students of color. But yet we had a huge endowment. We have a $3.5 billion endowment now for 3,000 students. Then it was about $1.7 billion. And so he shamed our trustees, literally, into, why are we not more diverse? So today we have about 19% who are low income, about 30% students of color, 10% international students. And as I said, my vision for the university when I went there was that we have an opportunity. It's great that we have increased the representational diversity, but we have an opportunity to become a truly inclusive university where people from various backgrounds learn how to have authentic relationships or at least conversations across difference. So that's go. Now, what's your question?
My follow-up is this. My career has been at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, which prides itself on being the most diverse university in the country. It's majority-minority student population. And the president of the university was going to give a talk to some retirees that I associate with. And preliminary to that, I checked some data. The university sent out a profile of its student body in 2021, and I dug into the archives and found the comparable distribution in 2005. And what appears happened, a good number of very high percentage increase in Latino enrollment, a solid increase in African American enrollment, a very impressive increase in Asian American enrollment, and a substantial decrease in white enrollment. So the grand total population student enrollment at the university hasn't changed between 2005 and 2021. And what struck me is that this particular institution, which prides itself on diversity, may have hit a tipping point. And I wonder if you've given any consideration to that in, certainly not in the situation of the University of Richmond, but more generally across American campuses.
Well, no, yeah, I have thought about that. As a matter of fact, when I was at Wheaton College, I had a conversation with a board committee when we were working on our strategic plan, where I said to them, you can be in a majority-minority situation and still be an unwelcome, have an unwelcome atmosphere for people of color. I mean, it's not about the numbers. It's about the attitudes of the people. They're about the way they interact with each other. You can be in a minority-majority institution and still feel like a guest in someone else's home. It's all about those attitudes. That's what I say when I was invited to my alma mater, Yale, to talk about these issues a few years ago. And I said to the dean, who was a good friend of mine, when he invited me, I said, well, let me tell you what my take is going to be on the subject. Yale, the Yale School of Music, you may know now, is tuition free. They got a big gift. So you pay $0 if you go there. So they're getting the best students from all over the world. And I said, the chances of your becoming more racially diverse are probably very low, based on that. I mean, there is some diversity there. And I said, so for me, when I come to speak to your staff, I'm going to be talking to them not so much about becoming more racially diverse and how you deal with it, but about their own attitudes. How do you interact with the people who are there? How do you prepare your students as graduates to go out and learn how to interact with people in the inner city when they go give informances, so that they can develop a rapport? And it's not hard. People are people, no matter where you go. That's what I learned early on in my career in education, when, as a freshman at Miami University, Miss Lois Limcole asked me to come and play for first graders. I said, what do I have to say to first graders? She said, well, they're people just like everyone else. And so what I decided to do, I went in and I told them a story about Bach. And I said, I'm going to play a piece for you written by a man who had more than 30 children. That got their attention. They were with me at that point. That's really what it's all about. You need to get their attention. So, I think there's been, critical mass is important. There's no doubt about that. But you can't only rely on that. That's why in my inaugural address, I said to the campus, you should be very proud that you've made some real strides with respect to representational diversity. But that's just the first step. Now we have to ensure that everyone in our community can thrive there. Everyone feels as though they belong. Everyone feels as though they can take advantage of everything we have to offer. Sorry, it was not yes.
So it's clear that the U.S. is more politically divided every day, and you spoke briefly about the AfD. Do you, as someone who has sort of this transatlantic perspective, being an American who spent significant time in Germany, do you believe that Germany is headed in the same direction, in the sense that we're becoming more politically divided and that people are unwilling to listen to each other?
No, it's a very good question, and my answer is perhaps. And it's not just Germany. Look around the world. I mean, because what you have now is you see there is becoming, at least it seems to me, a kind of a populist trend. Hungary, Turkey, now Italy. One of my friends said, and she's a woman. What difference should that make? But Italy, in France, the pushback against Macron. So I think that I'm speaking at the University of Augsburg. They've asked me to do the same presentation there next Tuesday. I think that the whole world needs to be paying attention to this. I think to some extent, I just read an article that people, of course, people always look to the United States as the wealthiest and most the powerful country, and that people are beginning to wonder. In fact, actually, it was one of. So I lived with the same German family for 3 years, and I'm still very close to the children of that family. And the wife of one of the children said to me, people are beginning to wonder. I mean, we always took democracy in the United States for granted. Well, so did we, those of us who lived there. And now in the last few years, you're seeing that, and that you can't take it for granted. And it's one of the reasons why, at least as a higher education leader, I've been adamant about what we need to do in higher education. Because what happens in the United States, I don't know about Germany, but in the United States, when I was a little boy, we had to learn civics. We had to learn about city government, state government, United States government. Now, in the United States, only 26% of the public can tell you what the three houses of government are, components of government are. I mean, we had to know that in elementary school. And I often, and the same is true in the United. So I'm getting off subject. So anyway, in terms of of Germany, yes, I think you have to pay attention to those tenets, those pillars of democracy that are important. And again, democracy. Theoretically, democracies should thrive on these competing ideas. But you can't have the competing ideas not interacting with each other. If you're in little bubbles, doing your own thing, then that's not going to help. Thank you for that question. Yes, Benedetta, and then Garrett.
Thank you, Ron. I just have like an observation, and it all sort of came together because of what you have been saying, and also because I went to an event this morning, which is basically in the framework of the Berlin Art Week now, was an exhibition, paintings, and there's a contemporary artist who's there, and he's basically illustrating all the fairy tales of the Grimm brothers. All of them.
Oh, yeah.
And he is putting in contemporary figures into the illustrations, so to bring these 200-year-old tales back in today. And you can actually, to help finance a this is now off track, to help finance it, you can have yourself painted into the illustration. So anyway, but he in like a minute, he gave us one of the fairy tales, and it was in German. And he tells it, and there are so many words in there that we do not know anymore today, that are not being used anymore in German, and that have a particular Bedeutung, but we just don't have it anymore. It has sort of flattened out. Yeah. And then you're talking about, the listening aspect that's important. And this morning in the audience, people are talking and looking, and there is this one person who is telling a fairy tale, and all of a sudden, everybody is like full attention. And I'm sort of trying to bring together all these things of what you have been saying. I mean, we have on the one hand, we have sort of language and how we learn language and how we go about taking care of our language that seems to become less and less important. Like mother tongue is not taught anymore at school or university. We communicate in 144 signs. And on the other hand, you are trying to deal with also with a generation that has become much more visual. We are on all our Instagrams and so on. And we are trying to work with all these terribly complex issues where we sort of come to the conclusion that speaking about them and listening to who's speaking are sort of the essential elements of making it work. So I'm wondering whether it can work at the end of the day if we are going in the way we're going. Language no longer being important, more visually focused than we are focused orally. Yeah. I mean, there's so much basic elements there that we are just like not even thinking about anymore.
And I mean, that's a real question. It's one of the reasons why I do want to query my social science and neuroscience folks about the Generation Z, with how they how they interact with. I mean, how whether or not it's that they curate interactions as opposed to navigating them, or as someone I just spoke to who was here before, and maybe it's curated for them by because of all the way that things are done. So I think, that's a real question. I mean, again, I have to be positive, a glass half full, but you have to look realistically at those issues. Garrett, you had a question?
Interesting. Great to have you here in Berlin. My name is Garrett Keast. I'm a conductor. I live here in Berlin, but I'm from Houston, Texas, and I was a student at the Butler, what's now called the Butler School of Music, but it was the University of Texas School of Music. And Ronald was the director of the School of Music there in the 90s when I was a student there. And actually, I'll tell you, it was a little quick, silly, funny story that I went to him because I'm a conductor and I needed money to put together a recital. And I wanted to rent one piece of music that I had no money for at the time at all. And it would cost, I think, about $350 to rent the Millot creation of the world, La Création du Monde. And so we've chatted about this in the last couple of years. But so I asked him, somebody suggested to me, well, go ask the director of the School of Music, Ronald Crutcher, who was, I think, new at the time, middle 90s or something. Yeah. And so I went to talk to him, and he was very nice about it, and he said yes, and I was so grateful for that because it was my first conducting recital, first conducting concert ever. Anyway, when I grew up in Houston, Texas, and I went to school at the University of Texas, and to me now, looking back at it all, with all the swirling politics of America and living in Germany now and everything, it's two big issues that really come up to me, and we already talked about a little bit. Megan brought up the tenure, which actually I'm hearing about tenure a lot in Texas and I think in, I hate to say, but Republican-leaning states. I mean, I think there's a big question about if tenure continues in Texas at the moment.
Right.
That's what I'm hearing.
Right. There was just there was a law that was passed, or that it's being considered. I don't know if it's been passed yet.
I have a friend who's my age who's now on the faculty at the University of Texas Butler Opera Center, Garnet Bruce, and I know that he's now in his second year there, and he has no chance for tenure. I think that's the case, and he's full-time associate professor. Mm-hmm. That's what he's telling me. I don't know exactly all the story, but and that I know that's changed though a lot, and just very much in the last couple of 2 or 3 years. The other thing I think is I would be really interesting. Sometime we have to talk about that. Love to talk to you about this, about affirmative action. Which was really, I don't hear the words brought up much now, but it was big time in the 90s. And I think even before that, and boy, I just certainly feel like in the United States, half of I don't know if it's half, but politically half the country is very against this.
Well, and there's a big case before the Supreme Court right now. The Harvard and another institution, is it UNC? I think it's UNC and Harvard. They're probably going to make an opinion come up with an opinion. But I will tell you, Larry Bacow, who's one of my mentors, in fact, it was because of Larry Bacow that I went to Wheaton College. He was on the board there at the time. The president of Harvard right now was with me at my last board meeting of ACE, and he was thanking the American Council on Education for their amicus brief. That's a letter to the court on behalf of, in support of the case, where they used the First Amendment, free speech, as a way to support the Harvard case. They were saying, are you going to tell a student who's black or Hispanic that they can't talk about their experiences as a black and Hispanic person? And the new judge on the court, Amy Coney Barrett, who has an adopted black daughter, actually quoted from that letter. This is what Larry Bacow told me. I wasn't there, but this is what he told us. So he felt slightly hopeful that maybe she was thinking deeper about the issues. But I think most people will tell you they expect that it will be they will vote against it, against affirmative action. Yeah, yes. Oh.
We also have an online question.
One more. Oh, is there an online question?
No. Do you want to?
There's one right over here. Okay.
Hi, thank you very much. I also enjoyed your speech, and you mentioned Hungary, Italy, and Germany, AfD, and France. I just finished a book which is some sort of a bestseller in Germany called Ein falsches Wort, One False Word, written by the long-term journalist of the Spiegel in the United States for 8 years, who's a liberal, progressive person, but he felt that recently he's talking about hundreds of examples of how in the university context people have been suffering, professors, and from the hypersensitivity of students, that they had to give up their jobs, have been thrown out, journalists, and so forth. And his conclusion would be, and I would like to have your take on that. His his conclusion is that this, in a way, helps the rise of right-wing nationalism.
I totally agree. And in fact, I have been part of 3 different presidential groups who are concerned about these issues. That's why the president of Cornell sent me that letter. She's part of one of the groups. And I said to this group, no one was talking about the role of the faculty. And I think I think the majority of the faculty at our universities are, when they're in the classroom, are objective and do the right thing in terms of not trying to instill their own values in students. There are people who do that, but they're in the minority. The problem is that, at least in my experience, the people who are in the middle, the majority, don't speak up. They are, because for one reason, they're too busy doing their work. They don't. But somehow we need to galvanize that middle. Because if I could have $100 for every faculty member who wrote me in private when we were having our discussions about the free expression statement, this is the right thing to do, we're supportive of it, but they wouldn't say it in public. I mean, in the end, we still, it was approved. The faculty didn't have to vote on it. The Board of Trustees voted on it. And so I fully agree. I do think that at our last ACE board meeting, we talked about this subject because the American Council on Education, as I said, the umbrella organization for all of higher education. So as these various laws were being passed in Florida and in Texas and in other states as well about divisive concepts, the ACE staff talked to presidents in those states. Do you think we should be doing something? And they all said, no, don't do anything, because that's exactly what the right wing wants. Oh, this liberal higher education group comes out, and as we talked about this issue in the meeting, we talked about the fact that often our faculties provide red meat for the far right, if you will, and they're totally oblivious that they're providing red meat. Now, I'll end by saying, just the other day there was a survey, and I almost included a reference here, but I have to look at it more closely. But this is a survey about whether or not diverse speakers representing diverse perspectives should be invited to campuses. And what was interesting is that 84% of the people responding to the survey said yes, 85% of Republicans, 86% Democrats said yes, they should be invited. Should students be expected to hear from those folks? It's not just inviting them, but should they be expected to go and attend? Again, the Democrats actually had a higher percentage than the Republicans in that. So one person in analyzing those results said that one of the reasons why there is this differential in perspectives between the general public and those at universities is that universities tend to be filled with people who are more liberal in general. And while that is true on the surface, there's also a range. It's not like, far left or far right. There's a range in between. And somehow we haven't figured out how to capture that or how to focus on that. And what I said to the group is that what we need to do is to utilize stories from our students, because the students make the most compelling, can make the most compelling arguments about what they're getting in the classroom. So I'd love to know what that book is, by the way. But I do think that unfortunately that is true. Christine?
Thank you, Ron. I'll take my privilege as the chair just to ask you a closing question, which takes us back to where you started. You talked about representation, the numbers, getting the numbers right, majority, minority. It's a sine qua non. You talked about belonging and making people feel comfortable in another's house. And you talked about capability, creating the capability in students to, I think your quote, you said, how to live in a democratic society. What can universities do to create those capabilities? We teach Greek, we teach Latin, we teach history, we teach physics, we teach everything. But we don't, or do we, teach negotiation skills? Do we teach, I grew up in the days when we still had debating societies. It was honorific, an honor to debate with your opponent in a point of view you might not even believe yourself, but you learn the skills and the argumentation to represent another point of view. And you often mention the listening. Is there a place in universities' first-year curriculum for creating these quote-unquote life skills?
Yes.
And I want to push you on this because it seems to me it's the most essential thing of university, letting them, curiosity we teach them, but how do we teach them these life skills for debate, dialogue, and engagement?
I could not agree with you more wholeheartedly, and I will say that that's one of the purposes of this dialogue facilitation network that we have. Although it is not across the board, it's only with a small cohort of students. The other thing I would say to you, the Constructive Dialogue Institute I mentioned, if I were the king of the University of Richmond, which I was not, I would have required that for all first-year students. It's something because what happens is that at least what our students told us, we've only used it twice, but what they said to us is that they learned why it was important to listen to views different from yourself. That it could actually, oh yeah, I had never thought about it that way. But if you've never been pushed in that direction, then you don't know how to flex that muscle and how to use it. And so this next fall, Christine, I will be going back. I'll teach one course, a first-year seminar. All of my students will be required to do that, and I'm going to keep pushing. I mean, we as president, I could only suggest that they use it, and they are using it now for a small cohort. But if it were left to me, I would have everyone do it from the very beginning, because then that gives them a baseline of work, and then you can build on that. And you know what? Our students are hungry for it. I had a speaker series called the Sharp Viewpoint Series. It was an endowed speaker series. The goal was to bring in speakers from a variety of perspectives, and we modeled how to have difficult conversations. And afterwards, I'm always amazed the number of students who would come up to me and say, "We need to do more of this, but you need to help us." And I'm not talking about one or two students. So like I said, I've never been king of a university, so that's not ever it's not going to happen that way. But I'm going to keep pushing, I'm actually going to use my first year seminar as a case study, and at least try my best to see if we can get that.
Well, I'd love to take that course. Thank you for a wonderful evening.
Truly, thank you. Thank you all for coming.